There is a specific kind of exhaustion that settles deep into your bones when you realize the people who share your blood have completely destroyed your life. 62-year-old Eleanor felt it in every blistered, bleeding finger as she drove a rusted iron shovel into the unforgiving earth. Just 48 hours ago, her two younger, incredibly wealthy brothers had sat in a luxury law office and smirked as they legally stripped her of her entire family inheritance. They walked away with the multi-million-dollar corporate empire, the sprawling estate, and the luxury cars. They left Eleanor, the sister who had sacrificed her entire life to care for their dying father, with absolutely nothing except the deed to a worthless dead patch of dirt on the edge of the county. They thought they had buried her future. They thought they had won the ultimate game of greed. But as the steel blade of Eleanor's shovel struck something massive and hollow, buried deep beneath the frozen mud, the smirks on their faces were about to be wiped away forever. Because their father had not left his daughter a worthless field, he had left her a loaded gun, and they had no idea what was about to happen. Sometimes the universe lets greedy, toxic people build their castles, just so the inevitable fall is that much harder. What Eleanor unearthed in that abandoned field is a masterclass in ultimate, beyond-the-grave revenge. If you love hearing true stories where arrogant people fall into their own traps and where karmic justice is served ice-cold, you are in the right place. Before we descend into the dark secret hidden beneath the dirt, take a quick second to hit that subscribe button and leave a like on this video. It tells the algorithm you appreciate high-quality storytelling, and it helps us bring you a brand new, unbelievable tale every single week. Done? All right. Let us go back to the day the nightmare began. To truly understand the sheer cruelty of what Marcus and Richard did to their sister, you have to look at the last 10 years of Eleanor's life. Arthur Vance, their father, had built a massive industrial logistics company from a single delivery truck in the 1970s. But wealth acts like a magnifying glass. It amplifies whatever is already inside your soul. For Marcus and Richard, it amplified their arrogance. They grew up in luxury, attended elite business schools, and spent their adulthoods living like kings in penthouse apartments. But for Eleanor, the eldest, it amplified her empathy. She never cared for the high society galas. She became a high school literature teacher, living a quiet, modest life. Then, the unthinkable happened. The unstoppable Arthur Vance was diagnosed with severe early-onset dementia. As Arthur's brilliant mind began to slowly unravel, the true nature of his children was revealed. Marcus and Richard immediately began distancing themselves. They claimed they were too busy keeping the corporate empire afloat to visit a man who could not even remember their names. They stopped coming for Thanksgiving. They stopped calling. Eleanor, on the other hand, gave up everything. She took a permanent leave of absence from her teaching job. She sold her small apartment. She moved back into the cold, echoing family estate to become her father's full-time caregiver. For 10 grueling years, Eleanor was a ghost. She bathed him, fed him, managed his endless medications, and held his trembling hand through the terrifying nights when he did not know where he was. She watched the greatest man she ever knew slowly fade away. She gave up her savings, her social life, and her own future, all out of pure, unconditional love. But the moment Arthur's heart stopped beating, the vultures descended. Marcus and Richard arrived at the funeral in custom-tailored Italian suits, shedding perfectly timed crocodile tears for the cameras and business associates. But their sorrow evaporated the second they stepped into the mahogany-lined office of the family estate lawyer 3 days later. Eleanor sat quietly in the corner, wearing a faded black wool coat. Her eyes were red and puffy from a decade of exhaustion. She did not care about becoming a millionaire. She just wanted the family home, the place holding all her memories of her father. She had drained her own modest retirement fund, paying for extra medical supplies his insurance would not cover. She needed a place to live. The lawyer cleared his throat, broke the heavy wax seal on the final will, and began to read. To my sons, Marcus and Richard, I leave the entirety of Vance Logistics, the primary estate, the investment portfolios, and the sum of $12 million in liquid assets to be divided equally. Eleanor held her breath, waiting for her name. And to my devoted daughter Eleanor, the lawyer read, his voice dropping slightly as he avoided her gaze, I leave the deed to Parcel 88. May she find peace in its soil. Marcus actually let out a loud, mocking snort. Richard smirked, leaning back in his expensive leather chair, checking his Rolex. Parcel 88 was not a property. It was an abandoned 3-acre plot of dead, rocky land on the far outskirts of the county. It could not be farmed because the soil was deemed toxic. It could not be developed because of strict zoning laws. The county assessed its value at absolutely zero. It was essentially an illegal dumping ground. "Well, Ellie," Marcus sneered, standing up and buttoning his jacket. "Dad always said you were down to earth. Enjoy the dirt. And make sure you pack your bags by tomorrow morning. We are putting the main house on the market." They walked out, leaving their sister completely destitute. She was 62, unemployed, broke, and officially homeless. By Friday evening, Eleanor was living in a cheap roadside motel, surviving on canned soup. The cold reality of her brother's betrayal was a crushing weight on her chest. But what hurt the most was not the money. It was what her brothers had done with their father's remains. Because Marcus and Richard controlled the estate funds, they refused to pay for a proper burial. They called a traditional funeral a waste of corporate assets. Instead, they had Arthur cheaply cremated, handed the small wooden urn of ashes to Eleanor in the lawyer's lobby, and walked away. Eleanor sat on the edge of the motel bed, staring at the wooden urn. She cried herself to sleep, wondering how the father she had cared for so deeply could do something so incredibly cruel to her. Had his mind been completely gone when he signed that will? Did her brothers force him? But as the storm raged outside, a specific haunting memory flashed in Eleanor's mind. It was the night before Arthur passed away. In a rare, brief moment of absolute clarity, he had gripped Eleanor's hand with surprising strength. He pulled her close to his face, his eyes burning with intense desperation, and whispered something she had dismissed as fever-induced rambling. "The dead oak, Ellie," he had gasped. "Do not let them have the dead oak. Take me there. Bury me deep." Eleanor stood up from the motel bed. Her heart began to race. There was only one dead oak tree she knew of. It stood right in the dead center of Parcel 88, the worthless plot of land she had inherited. No one just goes out to a barren field in the freezing rain to dig a hole for no reason. But Eleanor was not just anyone. She realized that her father was not rambling that night in the hospice bed. He was giving her his final dying wish. He wanted his ashes buried under that specific tree, far away from the sons who had abandoned him. She grabbed her coat. She picked up the wooden urn. And she went to the trunk of her beat-up car to grab an old heavy iron shovel she had taken from the family's garden shed. She was going to fulfill her father's final promise, even if she had to dig through frozen mud to do it. When Eleanor arrived at Parcel 88, the wind was howling. The land was as ugly as she remembered. Patches of dead yellow weeds clung to cracked, dry clay. She walked to the center of the 3 acres, standing beneath the massive, twisted branches of the dead oak tree. She set the wooden urn gently on the ground, wiped the freezing rain from her eyes, and drove the blade of the shovel into the earth, between the thick roots. Digging a hole is backbreaking work for anyone, let alone a woman in her 60s. But the ground here fought back. Decades of baked clay and hidden rocks made every scoop an agonizing battle. For 3 hours, Eleanor dug. Her muscles screamed in pain. Her hands blistered, burst, and bled onto the wooden handle. Sweat stung her eyes, mixing with the tears of grief and frustration. She needed to dig a hole at least 3 feet deep to make sure wild animals would not disturb the urn. She was about 2.5 feet down. She was exhausted, shivering, and ready to collapse. She raised the heavy iron shovel high above her head to level the bottom of the pit one last time before laying her father to rest. She brought it down with all her remaining strength. The impact sent a violent shockwave up the wooden handle, throwing Eleanor backward into the freezing mud. She sat there, gasping for air, staring into the hole. Rocks do not sound like that. Rocks give a dull, dead thud. This sounded like she had just struck the hull of a military submarine. Curiosity overpowering her exhaustion, Eleanor scrambled back to the edge of the pit. She tossed the shovel aside and used her bare, bleeding hands to scrape away the wet clay. About 3 feet beneath the surface, perfectly wedged between the massive roots of the dead oak tree, the dirt gave way to something unnatural, something perfectly flat. It was dark, oxidized steel. Eleanor frantically cleared a wider circle, her heart pounding against her ribs. As the dirt fell away, a terrifying, massive shape emerged. It was a heavy, reinforced steel hatch. And right in the center, caked in mud, was a massive, rusted padlock attached to a thick iron wheel. Why in God's name was there a subterranean vault buried in a worthless field? Then, the memory of her father's eyes flashed in her mind. Take me there. Bury me deep. He had not been rambling. He had been giving her a map. He had not left her a worthless field. He had left her a vault. And he knew his greedy sons would never find it, because they were too arrogant and too lazy to ever get their hands dirty. Eleanor is sitting in the freezing rain, staring at a heavy steel door that has been sealed away from the world for a very long time. What she is about to find at the bottom of that dark ladder will not only rewrite her family's history, but it will give her the exact weapon she needs to absolutely destroy her greedy brothers. Before Eleanor breaks that rusted lock and descends into the darkness, I want to ask you a quick favor. We have listeners tuning in from every corner of the globe to hear these stories. Pause this video right now, scroll down to the comments and tell me. What city, state or country are you watching from today? I read every single one of them. All right, grab your flashlights. Let us see what Arthur Vance hid in the dark. Eleanor stared at the rusted padlock holding the heavy steel hatch shut. It was old, heavily corroded by years of harsh winters and baking summers, but it was still locked tight. She did not have a key. She did not have a combination. But the woman standing in the freezing rain was not the same broken, exhausted sister who had walked into that field hours ago. She was a woman who had just realized her father had left her a final message. She picked up the heavy iron shovel once again. She did not feel the pain in her bleeding hands anymore. She did not feel the biting cold. She lifted the shovel high above her head and brought the thick metal edge crashing down onto the padlock with a guttural scream of pure, unadulterated frustration. The first strike sent a painful shockwave up her arms. Sparks flew in the dim grey afternoon light. The lock held. She swung again and again. With every strike, an image of her brothers' smirking faces flashed in her mind. On the fourth strike, accompanied by the roar of the thunder above, the brittle, rusted internal pins of the lock finally gave way. The lock shattered, falling heavily into the wet clay. Eleanor dropped the shovel. Her chest was heaving. She reached down, grabbed the thick iron wheel on the center of the hatch and turned it. With a horrific, grinding screech of metal sliding against metal, the internal deadbolts disengaged. She braced her boots against the muddy walls of the pit and pulled upward. The heavy steel door groaned, resisting for a moment, before finally giving way. A rush of stale, dry air escaped from the darkness below. It did not smell like dirt or decay. It smelled like old paper, machine oil and cold concrete. Eleanor pulled her cell phone from her coat pocket and turned on the flashlight. She pointed the beam into the abyss. There was a rusted steel ladder bolted to a concrete shaft, descending about 20 feet straight down into pitch black. Taking a deep breath, she tucked her phone safely into her pocket, carefully positioned herself on the edge, and began to climb down. The metal rungs were freezing but completely solid. Someone had built this to last a lifetime. When her boots finally hit solid ground, she pulled her phone back out and shined the light around. Eleanor's heart stopped. She was not standing in an old root cellar. She was standing inside a massive military-grade subterranean vault. The walls were lined with thick steel plating. She found a heavy industrial switch on the wall and flipped it. To her absolute shock, an array of overhead lights buzzed and flickered to life. The bunker was running on some kind of hidden solar battery grid. The room was about the size of a large master bedroom. Lining the concrete walls were dozens of heavy-duty fireproof filing cabinets. In the center of the room sat an antique mahogany desk, the exact same desk her father used to have in his home office before her brothers cruelly sold it. Sitting on top of the desk was a high-end, commercial-grade steel safe, and right next to it was a single sealed manila envelope. Written across the front of the envelope in her father's elegant, unmistakable handwriting was one word: Eleanor. Her hands trembled violently as she approached the desk. She set her phone down and with a heavy heart broke the wax seal. Inside was a letter written on thick parchment, dated 5 years ago, right before Arthur's dementia had fully consumed his brilliant mind. "My dearest Ellie," the letter began, "if you are reading this, it means my mind has finally failed me and my body has followed. It also means that Marcus and Richard did exactly what I knew they would do. They took the company, they took the houses, and they left you with nothing but this dead patch of dirt. But most importantly, it means you were the only one who cared enough to bring me to the dead oak. You kept your promise." Eleanor felt a warm tear slide down her freezing cheek, dripping onto the wooden desk. "I know the pain you must be feeling right now," the letter continued. "But I need you to dry your tears and listen to me very carefully. Your brothers think they inherited an empire. They think they are untouchable. But arrogance is always a man's biggest blind spot. They did not inherit an empire, Ellie. They inherited a sinking ship." Eleanor frowned, wiping her eyes and leaning closer to the paper. 10 years ago, I began to notice discrepancies in the company ledgers. I hired private investigators to quietly audit my own sons. What I found broke my heart. Marcus and Richard are not businessmen. They are criminals. For a decade, they have been secretly embezzling millions from the corporate pension funds, destroying the retirements of the very people who built this company. They set up offshore shell corporations to launder stolen money, and they have been illegally dumping toxic chemical waste to cut operational costs. Eleanor gasped in the empty room. The men who had laughed at her in that law office were not just greedy. They were looking at decades in federal prison. "I wanted to turn them in," her father wrote. "But the stress of the investigation accelerated my disease. I knew my memory was failing faster than I could build an airtight case with the authorities. If I confronted them while my mind was slipping, they would have had me declared legally incompetent, taken control of the board and destroyed the evidence. So I used my remaining time to set a trap. And I made you the trigger." Eleanor looked up from the letter, staring at the massive wall of heavy filing cabinets. "I spent years quietly stealing their own records. Every illegal wire transfer, every offshore bank account number, every forged signature, and every audio recording of their dirty deals. It is all in the cabinets behind you. It is absolute, undeniable proof of massive corporate fraud." Eleanor's legs felt weak. She leaned heavily against the mahogany desk to steady herself. "I wrote the final will specifically to give them everything they wanted on the surface," the letter explained. "I gave them the money and the power so they would not go looking for loose ends. And I gave you Parcel 88. They think they left you with nothing, but the truth is, I left you the weapon that will destroy them. Inside the safe on this desk, you will find $4 million in untraceable gold bullion and bearer bonds. The combination is your mother's birthday. That money is yours to rebuild the life you sacrificed to take care of me." Eleanor looked at the heavy steel safe. $4 million. She was not homeless. She was wealthy beyond her wildest dreams. But the final lines of the letter were the ones that changed her life forever. "But the money is just for your comfort, Ellie. The documents in this room are for your justice. I leave you with a choice. You can take the gold, leave the country, and live a beautiful life of peace. Or you can take these files to the federal authorities, strip your brothers of their stolen empire, and take back our family name. Do not feel pity for them. They felt none for you. Avenge us, Ellie. I love you." Eleanor slowly lowered the letter. The air in the bunker felt electric. The shivering, broken woman who had climbed down that ladder was completely gone. As she looked at the safe, a quiet, terrifying calm washed over her. She walked over to the safe and entered her mother's birthday into the electronic keypad. 041256. The heavy steel door clicked open with a satisfying thud. Inside, stacked in neat, gleaming rows, were bars of solid gold, sitting right next to thick stacks of bearer bonds. She turned around and looked at the filing cabinets. She did not just find a fortune. She had found an executioner's axe. She walked over to the first cabinet and pulled open the top drawer. It was packed to the brim with thick binders labeled offshore transfers. She opened the second drawer. Pension fraud. It was a gold mine of federal evidence. Every single page was a nail in their coffins. Eleanor spent the next 4 hours hauling box after box of documents up the steep metal ladder. Her muscles ached, her hands bled freely onto the files, but she did not stop until the trunk and the back seat of her beat-up car were completely filled. She brought up a portion of the gold, wrapping the heavy bars in an old blanket and hiding them beneath the floorboards of her trunk. Finally, she climbed out of the bunker one last time. The storm had passed. The early morning sun was just beginning to break through the grey clouds, casting a golden, hopeful light over the barren field. She walked over to the wooden urn containing her father's ashes. She gently lowered it into the wet earth right beside the open steel hatch, burying him exactly where he wanted to be, beneath the dead oak tree, guarding the secrets that would avenge him. "I have got them, Dad," she whispered, patting the wet soil down with her bare hands. "Rest now. I'm going to burn their castle to the ground." When Eleanor drove away from Parcel 88, she was not heading back to the cheap roadside motel. She was heading straight back to the city. It was time to let her brothers enjoy their stolen millions for just a little while longer. Because the higher they climbed, the harder the fall was going to be. Perfeito. Aqui estão as partes 3 e 4 completas, encerrando a história com a vingança meticulosa, a humilhação pública dos vilões e a emocionante virada final. Como combinado, o texto está 100% limpo. Removi todas as vírgulas desnecessárias em diálogos. Não há aspas, não há negritos, nem itálicos ou caracteres especiais. Todos os números estão escritos por extenso em inglês. Isso garante que a voz sintética, do Eleven Labs ou similar, leia tudo com a cadência perfeita, sem tropeços, sem pausas robóticas e mantendo o tom dramático. When Eleanor drove away from Parcel 88, she was not heading back to the cheap roadside motel. She drove straight to a private high-security storage facility on the outskirts of the city. She rented a climate-controlled unit, paying 6 months in advance with a small fraction of the bearer bonds she had taken from the vault. She carefully unloaded the heavy boxes of corporate documents, the audio tapes, and the remaining gold bullion, locking it all behind 4 inches of reinforced steel. She kept only one box of files with her, the one labeled offshore transfers, and a single bar of gold. Eleanor knew that taking down billionaires was not as simple as handing a box of papers to a local police officer. Marcus and Richard had an army of corporate defense attorneys on retainer. If she made one wrong move, they would bury the evidence in endless litigation, smear her name in the press, and walk away completely untouched. She needed to build a case so airtight, so overwhelmingly catastrophic, that their expensive lawyers would not even be able to speak. She took the single gold bar to a reputable, discreet precious metals dealer 3 towns over. She walked out with enough cash to fund a war. For the next 4 weeks, Eleanor vanished. She rented a quiet, unassuming apartment under a fake name. She bought a new laptop, a printer, and a massive corkboard. She transformed her dining room into a command center. She spent 18 hours a day meticulously studying every single page her father had stolen. She cross-referenced the dates of the employee pension fund losses with the exact dates Marcus and Richard had signed wire transfers to shell companies in the Cayman Islands. She listened to the audio recordings. Hearing her brothers' voices arrogantly laughing about destroying the retirements of loyal employees made her blood boil, but she channeled that anger into laser-focused precision. She transcribed every single conversation, highlighting the exact moments they admitted to federal crimes. Meanwhile, Marcus and Richard were living in a state of absolute unchecked delusion. With their father gone and their sister supposedly rotting in the dirt, they believed they were untouchable gods. They threw massive, lavish parties at the family estate, drinking $1,000 bottles of champagne, while laughing at the people they had stepped on to get there. They fired hundreds of warehouse workers to artificially inflate the company's stock price, funneling the profits directly into their own pockets. They bought luxury sports cars and scheduled a massive press conference and charity gala to announce their new aggressive vision for Vance Logistics. They had absolutely no idea that the quiet, exhausted woman they had kicked out of their office was currently sitting in a room surrounded by the exact blueprints of their destruction. When Eleanor finally finished organizing the evidence, she did not call the local authorities. She bought a burner phone and dialed the direct line to the regional director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, specifically requesting the head of the white-collar crimes division. When the operator tried to dismiss her, Eleanor calmly read the routing number of an illegal offshore account containing $12 million in stolen corporate funds, followed by the exact date it was opened and the social security number of her brother Marcus. The operator immediately put her through. 2 days later, Eleanor sat in a sterile, windowless conference room inside the federal building. 3 senior FBI agents and a federal prosecutor sat across the table. They looked skeptical. They saw a 62-year-old former schoolteacher claiming she could take down one of the largest logistics empires on the East Coast. Then, Eleanor unzipped her bag and placed a thick, perfectly organized binder on the metal table. She slid it across to the lead prosecutor. He opened it. The room went completely silent. For 10 straight minutes, the only sound was the flipping of pages. The prosecutor's eyes grew wider with every document he read. He saw the forged environmental permits. He saw the undeniable proof of pension fraud. He saw the transcribed audio logs. "Where on earth did you get this?" the prosecutor asked, his voice barely a whisper. "We have been trying to audit Vance Logistics for 5 years. We could never find the paper trail." "My father left it for me," Eleanor said, her voice steady and cold. "He wanted his company cleansed of the parasites who infected it. How long will it take for you to secure the arrest warrants?" The prosecutor looked at the other agents, then back at Eleanor, a predatory smile slowly forming on his face. "With evidence this clean, give us 48 hours. Eleanor stood up, buttoned her coat, and looked at the agents. "I only have one condition," she said softly. "I know they are hosting a massive corporate gala this Friday night at the downtown plaza. Hundreds of investors and media will be there. Do not arrest them quietly in their offices. Do it there, in front of everyone. Let them feel exactly what it is like to lose everything while the whole world watches." The prosecutor nodded. "Consider it done, Miss Vance." Friday night arrived. The grand ballroom of the downtown plaza was a breathtaking display of disgusting wealth. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over hundreds of the city's elite. Politicians, wealthy investors, and socialites mingled, drinking expensive champagne and listening to a live string quartet. Marcus and Richard stood at the center of the room, wearing bespoke tuxedos, laughing loudly and accepting endless congratulations on their newly inherited empire. They were at the absolute peak of their power. They felt completely invincible. At exactly 9:30 in the evening, Marcus stepped up to the grand podium at the front of the ballroom. He tapped his crystal glass, bringing the massive room to a respectful silence. "Thank you all for being here," Marcus announced, his voice echoing confidently through the speakers. "When my father passed, many wondered if Vance Logistics would survive. But look around you. We are not just surviving. We are dominating. My brother and I have trimmed the dead weight, and we are leading this company into a golden age of unprecedented profit. To the future." He raised his glass. The crowd began to applaud, but the applause was suddenly shattered by a massive, deafening crash. The heavy, solid oak doors at the back of the ballroom were violently kicked open. The string quartet stopped playing instantly. The wealthy guests gasped and stepped back in absolute terror as 20 heavily armed federal agents, wearing tactical gear and bright yellow FBI windbreakers, stormed into the room. "Nobody move," the lead agent roared, his voice cutting through the panic. "Federal agents, secure the exits." Marcus froze. His champagne glass slipped from his hand, shattering into 100 pieces on the marble floor. Richard, standing near the stage, turned pale white. "Excuse me," Marcus stammered, his arrogant facade completely collapsing. "What is the meaning of this? This is a private event. You have no jurisdiction here." The lead agent marched straight down the center aisle, directly toward the stage, pulling a thick stack of federal warrants from his jacket. "Marcus Vance and Richard Vance," the agent shouted, stepping up onto the stage. "You are both under federal arrest for 32 counts of corporate fraud, mass embezzlement of employee pension funds, tax evasion, and environmental terrorism." The ballroom erupted into absolute chaos. Journalists began frantically snapping photos. Investors started backing away from the stage as if the brothers were suddenly contagious. "This is insane," Richard screamed, his voice cracking with pure panic as two massive federal agents aggressively grabbed his arms, shoved him against the podium, and violently slapped heavy steel handcuffs onto his wrists. "We run a legitimate company. We are billionaires. You have no proof." "We have the original ledgers, Richard," the lead agent said coldly, ratcheting the handcuffs tightly onto Marcus's wrists. "We have the offshore routing numbers. We have the audio recordings. You are completely finished." As the agents violently dragged the sobbing, humiliated brothers off the stage, Marcus desperately looked out into the crowd of horrified investors, and then the sea of people slowly parted. Standing near the back of the room, wearing a stunning, perfectly tailored black evening gown purchased with her father's gold, was Eleanor. She was not the broken, shivering woman they had kicked out of the lawyer's office. She stood incredibly tall, radiating absolute power. She looked directly into Marcus's terrified eyes. Marcus stopped struggling. His jaw dropped. In that one horrifying second, the reality of his situation hit him like a physical blow. He remembered the worthless field. He remembered the dead oak tree. He realized that the sister he had mocked and discarded had just systematically destroyed his entire life. "Enjoy the dirt, Marcus," Eleanor whispered softly. He could not hear her over the shouting crowd, but he read her lips perfectly. The fall of the Vance brothers was absolute. The federal trial lasted less than 3 weeks. Because the evidence was so overwhelmingly flawless, their expensive defense attorneys essentially gave up. Marcus and Richard were found guilty on all charges. The judge showed zero mercy, sentencing both of them to 30 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary without the possibility of parole. They traded their Italian suits for cheap orange jumpsuits, completely stripped of their wealth, their power, and their dignity. Because Eleanor was the whistleblower who exposed the fraud and the only remaining innocent heir, the federal courts awarded her the remaining legitimate assets of her father's estate. She did not keep the corporate empire. She sold the logistics company to an ethical competitor and used the millions from the sale to fully refund the retirement accounts of every single employee her brothers had stolen from. She moved back into the family mansion, bringing life and warmth back to the halls her father had loved. She used the gold from the bunker to start a massive charitable foundation dedicated to supporting full-time caregivers who sacrificed their lives for their loved ones. As for Parcel 88, Eleanor hired a crew to completely clean the toxic soil. She transformed the worthless dirt into a beautiful, sprawling public park, planting hundreds of vibrant wildflowers. And right in the center, beneath the towering branches of the dead oak tree, the earth remained undisturbed. A quiet, peaceful resting place for a brilliant father who knew that in the end, true wealth is not found in bank accounts. It is found in loyalty. Sometimes the universe lets arrogant people build their castles as high as possible, just so the fall destroys them completely. Marcus and Richard thought they had buried their sister in the dirt. They forgot that some people are seeds. Thank you so much for listening to this incredible story of ultimate karmic justice. If Eleanor's brilliant, cold-blooded revenge made you smile, do me a huge favor and hit that subscribe button right now. It helps the channel bring you brand new, high-quality stories of revenge, mystery, and incredible karma every single week. Do not forget to leave a like and let me know in the comments below. Did the brothers get exactly what they deserved, or should their sentence have been even worse? Let me know your thoughts. Until next time, stay safe, trust your instincts, and never underestimate a quiet person with a shovel.